this is, well, let me see if I can look at this. This is not really what I would call a PowerPoint presentation. I use the PowerPoint really as substitute for a blackboard, so not everything I say will be on or outlined on the PowerPoint. There are fairly extensive quotes in the first part of the lecture, and that's because I want you to see them because Dewey scholars rarely look, even today, rarely look at what Dewey wrote before he was a pragmatist in his so-called experimental idealist period. And most of the lengthy quotes will be from Dewey, the experimental idealist, the late Dewey of the 1890s. And in 1903, Dewey sent a letter to James in which he basically asked permission to dedicate a volume of written by Dewey and other people to James, and James learned that Dewey was a convert, and James learned to his great joy that Dewey was a convert to pragmatism. And Dewey basically died yesterday. I mean, he lived for, not quite, but he lived, I think, into 1961, I think, but he lived basically forever. A clever device, let's see now, of John Gardner's novel, October Light, a novel I recommend if you haven't read it, is one of the two main characters, Sally, is reading a trashy novel. Pages of the trashy novel are embedded in the main story. And in the trashy novel, a character called Santacia says, everything's got to be an accident unless you decide there are gods and devils. We do nothing. Peter Wagner's uncle plows out snow and saves freezing people by pure accident because he's caught in the Sunday school bag, or his father was a doctor, or God knows what. Captain Fist does all these ungodly things because it happened to rain all through his childhood, or his father was a drunk, or he's an XXY, or his blood's deficient in, say, riboflavin. So everybody's a machine. An automaton, unless you decide there are gods and devils and there's some magic way they can get to you. The fallacies in this half-baked little piece of philosophy are easy to spot, and many of them get discussed, although not in connection with October Light, of course, in those weeks of any problems of philosophy course that take up freedom of the topic of freedom of the will. First and foremost, there's a confusion of fatalism, the idea that everything we do is determined by external causes, with determinism, the idea that what happens in the future depends on what happened in the past according to the laws of physics, say the laws of Newtonian physics. And there's Santacia's odd idea that whatever happens deterministically is an accident. And there's the assumption that ethical subjectivism, the doctrine that judgments of right and wrong are mere expressions of ultimately arbitrary factors. This is hidden in the sneering claim that Wagner's uncle's brave actions were merely the accidental results of the Sunday school bag, also follows immediately from determinism, as if one couldn't be a determinist who believes that there are objectively valid ethical truths. Moving to a more sophisticated level, the lecture in the Problems of Philosophy course is likely to point out that Hume famously came to the conclusion that there's a distinction between actions we do of our own free will, actions we're morally responsible for, and actions we are compelled to do that we are not responsible for. Say someone holds a gun to our head or even pushes our limbs to make us do what he wants us to do. There's that different distinction even in a deterministic world. Indeed, Hume argued that it would be precisely in a world in which there was no predictability to human actions, it would be precisely in a world in which there isn't any predictability to human actions, that notions of responsibility and freedom would collapse. The position that there's no incompatibility between free will in the ordinary language sense and determinism is called, quite naturally, compatibilism. Maybe Hume was the first ordinary language philosopher. Naturally, not all philosophers agree that compatibilism is right. And there's also dispute, which I will not go into in this lecture, as to the bearing or lack of bearing on the question of the fact that today's physics, unlike Newton's, is indeterministic rather than deterministic. But if compatibilism is right, as I think it largely is, I say largely because something does have to be said about determinism and indeterminism, an issue that James cared greatly about, then what needs a pragmatist like Dewey add to what Hume had already pointed out? Well, some of Dewey's thought already showed signs of pragmatism in the early 1890s, when he still considered himself an experimental idealist. In fact, Dewey was concerned as early as 1894 to argue in a syllabus titled The Study of Ethics that the classical picture of a free will actually makes the free will, or the self with a capital S, something external to the embodied human person. In the end, our free will becomes a sort of foreign agent. So the determinist, Dewey means a philosopher who, like Santacia, denies that we have freedom to choose. And the indeterminist, Dewey means a philosopher who defends the classical picture of a free will, picture our volitions as imposed upon us from outside, or as coming from outside the only self we truly know, our motives and character. The indeterminist Dewey referred to was a philosopher named James Martineau, who claimed that free action requires the presence of a, quotes, deciding self, a personal center of, this is Martineau, quotes, a personal center of intelligence and causality, distinct from one's acquired character, habits, and motives. Against Martineau, Dewey argued that, quotes, the necessity of the deciding self, in Martineau's terminology, or in Martineau's metaphysics, is a necessity originated wholly through the failure to recognize the present moving self in motive and character. The problem comes out clearly when we find this problem stated as if it were an alternative between determination of the volition by character and motives or by the self, the free will. The truth of the matter is that Martineau, and so with all the other indeterminists, simply accepts the adequacy of the necessitarian psychology of volition up to a certain point, and then seeing the ethical insufficiency, helps himself out by bringing in the deus ex machina, a free will. This is the reason the contests between indeterminists and determinists are so futile and unending. Both have the same premises, the product of inadequate psychological analysis. The only way to rescue freedom from the attack of the determinist is not to bring it in as a third factor, which is one of Martineau's terms for the free will, but to reconstruct the theory of motive and character, so as to bring out the functional presence of the self in them and their consequent flexible, dynamic structure. The criticism of the indeterminist holds equally, therefore, against the determinist, that is, the predeterminist, what I call the fatalist. He makes the same abstraction of motive, erecting hunger, love of praise, modesty, etc., into little entities which pull and haul on a self outside of them. Or going into a wider field, he talks of the determination of self by heredity and environment, like Santacia. He has the two things set over against each other, and with only a mechanical connection between them, one of force, just as if the indeterminist can get only an arbitrary relation. They both argue then, as if it were a question between mechanical causation on one side and arbitrary interference on the other, forgetting that both alternatives arise from the unexamined assumption of the dualism of self and ideal and motive. The whole controversy vanishes in thin air when we substitute for the determination of volition by circumstances or by free will, the determination of self in volition, indeed, its passage into definite unified activity. If something is missing in this early work, it's the concern with the practical significance of the issue of free will that one expects from a pragmatist. But after his conversion from idealism to pragmatism in 1903, this concern is omnipresent. In his 1910-11 Contributions to a Cyclopedia of Education, for example, we find, as many of you know, Dewey was a lifelong educator. The University of Chicago to this day still has the school, the experimental school that Dewey founded, and he more than once suggested that philosophy itself could be regarded as the general theory of education. And so in the Contributions to a Cyclopedia of Education, for example, we find Dewey writing just in the, this is a short version of this quote, just in the degree to which one is gifted with a habit of reflection, in that degree is capable of acting in the light for a foreseen future instead of being pushed from behind by sheer instinct or habit. With respect to freedom, then, the task of the educator is threefold. First, to keep alive, so he immediately translates the question of what does it mean to believe in free will in Dewey's sense? How would that translate into what I do in the classroom? First, to keep alive plasticity, initiative, capacity to vary, to prevent induration and fixation in fossilized automatic habits. Even a thoroughly good habit needs to be kept flexible so it may be adapted when the need arises to circumstances not previously experienced even by way of anticipation. Second, to confirm preferences, to build up and strengthen positive and constructive interests in specific directions. Nothing is more fatal practically than the growth of a spirit of indifference, of boredom, or of miscellaneous and easily diverted responsiveness. Thirdly, to make preferences reasonable. That is to say, to develop in individuals the habit of forecasting the consequences of acting upon a given preferential tendency, of comparing one set of results with another, and by these means enlightening preference as to its own deeper and more abiding nature. Capacity transforms habit when required. Steady and specific interests, foresight and deliberation. Given these factors of character, and purely speculative difficulties in the concept of freedom may be left serenely alone. In the 1922 Human Nature and Conduct, Dewey explicitly relates the free will issue to political struggles. One has to turn from moral theories to the general human struggle for political and economic and religious liberty, for freedom of thought, speech, assemblage, and creed, to find significant reality in the conception of freedom of the will. Then one finds himself out of the stiflingly close atmosphere of an inner consciousness and in the open-air world. The cost of confining moral freedom to an inner region is the almost complete severance of ethics from politics and economics. The former is regarded as summed up in edifying exhortations, and the latter is connected with arts of expediency separated from larger issues of good. In short, there are two schools of social reform. One, remember, 1922 was just a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, when Marxism was very much a topic of discussions. Communist and socialist parties were huge and shaking the world. In short, there are two schools of social reform. One bases itself upon the notion of a morality which springs from inner freedom, something mysteriously cooped up within personality. It asserts that the only way to change institutions is for men to purify their own hearts, and that when this has been accomplished, change of institutions will follow of itself. The other school, say the Marxist-Leninists, deny the existence of any such inner power, and in so doing conceive that it has denied all moral freedom. It says that men are made what they are by forces of the environment, and that human nature is purely malleable, and until institutions are changed, nothing can be done. Clearly, this leaves the outcome as hopeless as does an appeal to inner rectitude and benevolence, for it provides no leverage for change of environment. It throws us back upon an accident, usually disguised as a necessary law of history or evolution, and trusts to some violent change symbolized by civil war to usher in an abrupt millennium. There is an alternative to being penned in between these two theories. We can recognize that all conduct is interaction between elements of human nature and the environment, natural and social. Then we shall see that progress proceeds in two ways, and that freedom is found in the kind of interaction which maintains an environment in which human desire and choice count for something. Dewey's remarks remind us that philosophical theories of the self and of its freedom, or lack thereof, have historically been of momentous importance. And they place those theories in the context of the difference they make to education, to politics, and to life in general. And doing so, that is what both James and Dewey urge us to do with all philosophical issues. Indeed, they saw this as implied by the very concept of pragmatism. But the third of the classical pragmatist trio, Charles Peirce, had a different understanding. James' book, Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking, was a lightly revised transcript of the lectures that James delivered in Boston in November and December of 1906. Although he took the name Pragmatism from Peirce, it's well known that Peirce didn't think that James' version of the doctrine was true to his intentions, and later went so far as to change the name of his own philosophy from pragmatism to pragmaticism. Although some of the themes of James' pragmatism had already been introduced in a lecture titled Philosophical Results and Practical Conceptions that James delivered at the University of California in 1898, it was the publication of the Lowell lectures, Pragmatism, that made James a celebrated philosopher as well as the best-known American psychologist. James opened the lecture with an example of a fruitless dispute about a pseudo-issue, the sort of dispute he suggests that pragmatism can save us from. Some years ago, here's James, some years ago, being with a camping party in the mountains, I returned from a solitary ramble to find everyone engaged in a ferocious metaphysical dispute. The corpus of the dispute was a live squirrel supposed to be clinging to one side of a tree trunk, while over against the tree's opposite side, a human being was imagined to stand. This human witness tries to get sight of the squirrel by moving rapidly around the tree. But no matter how fast he goes, the squirrel moves as fast in the opposite direction and always keeps the tree between himself and the man, so that never a glimpse of him is caught. The resultant metaphysical problem now is this: does the man go around the squirrel or not? He goes around the tree, sure enough, and the squirrel is on the tree, but does he go around the squirrel? James tells us that he immediately replied that which party is right, depends on what you practically mean by going round the squirrel. He continues by acknowledging his debt to Peirce, whom he quotes as saying that, quotes, to attain perfect clearness in our thoughts of an object, then we need only consider what conceivable effects of a practical kind the object may involve, what sensations we would expect from it, and what reactions we must prepare. Our conception of these effects, whether immediate or remote, is then for us the whole of our conception of the object, so far as that conception has positive significance at all. And I wonder, by the way, that this use of the term positive significance here, which does suggest some connection with Auguste Comte's positivism. I've never seen that discussed, actually. James just quoted resolution of this. No, not ready for that. James just quoted resolution of this curious metaphysical problem is supposed to illustrate Peirce's maxim. And without a doubt, Peirce would have agreed with James' resolution of this, quotes, metaphysical problem. But James' acknowledgement of indebtedness, while certainly sincere, has to be taken with a grain of salt. And I now want to look at the differences between James' version of the maxim and the original version. James does not accept the fact-value dichotomy, the idea facts are objective and values are just subjective. He does not consider value judgments to be merely subjective, and he does not think that cognition can be identified with scientific cognition, or that the natural sciences are the only paradigm we have for cognition. On these things, the classical pragmatists, Dewey, James, Peirce, all agreed. Yet Peirce's position was in certain respects very different from that of the others. Peirce rejected the fact-value dichotomy, but he did not reject the Kantian dichotomy between pure and impure interests. He insisted that the interest that drives pure scientific inquiry is utterly different from the interests that drive ordinary practical inquiry, while Dewey and James strongly disagree. If one does not know this, one can't understand why Peirce distanced himself from pragmatism. However, if one were in the position of reading the second lecture in the volume Pragmatism, where he discusses the pragmatic maxim at length, without having read anything by Peirce, one might well think that James did not start anything new, that he was just a devotee of an ongoing movement. That is, in fact, what he claims. Quotes, "There's absolutely nothing new in the pragmatic method," so James. "Socrates was an adept at it. Aristotle used it methodically. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume made momentous contributions to truth by its means. Shadworth Hodgson keeps insisting that realities are only what they are known as. But these forerunners of pragmatism used it in fragments. They were preluders only. Not until our time has it generalized itself, become conscious of a universal mission, pretended to a conquering destiny. I believe in that destiny, and I hope I may end by inspiring you with my belief." Here James is posing as someone converted to a movement to which Peirce also belongs. But even when Peirce and James agree in a verbal formulation, such as the ones he quotes in this lecture, they take that formulation in very different ways. This is complicated by the fact that there are difficulties in understanding how either one of them took the formulation. Let's look at the way in which James paraphrases Peirce in what must have been almost the opening minutes of this lecture. This is James' first lecture on pragmatism. Second lecture on pragmatism. This purports to be a direct statement of what Peirce says in the all-important article, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, which first appeared in 1878. And I quote, "Mr. Peirce, after pointing out that our beliefs are really rules for action, said that to develop a thought's meaning, we need only determine what conduct it is fitted to produce. That conduct is for us its sole significance. And the tangible fact that at the root of all our thought distinctions, however subtle, is that there is no one of them so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference in practice. To attain perfect clearness in our thought of an object, then, we need only consider what conceivable effects of a practical kind the object may involve, what sensations we are to expect from it, and what reactions we must prepare. Our conception of these effects, whether immediate or remote, is then for us the whole of our conception of the object, so far as that conception has positive significance at all." I notice he retains the word positive from Peirce. I said that this purports to be a direct statement of what Peirce says. In fact, Peirce himself gives it a sort of endorsement. In the first place, there's the definition of James, whose definition differs from mine only in that he does not restrict the meaning, that is the ultimate logical interpretant, as I do, to a habit, but allows percepts, that is complex feelings endowed with compulsiveness, to be such. If he's willing to do this, I do not quite see how we need give any room at all to habit. But practically, his view and mine must, I think, coincide, except where he allows considerations not at all pragmatic to have weight. A qualified endorsement, I would say. Let's look at the definition of Peirce, that is James' paraphrase of Peirce, closely. It is right, oh, wait a minute. It is right that James thought of beliefs as rules for action, although Peirce generally prefers the term habit, a central metaphysical notion in Peirce's philosophy, and one which applies to inorganic as well as organic, as well as the organic world. Peirce's inspiration was Alexander Bain's definition of belief as, quotes, that upon which a man is prepared to act, a definition which was much discussed in the Metaphysical Club in Cambridge in the 1870s, the discussion circle to which both James and Peirce belonged. Part of what this definition of belief means is clear. Peirce and James are saying that to really have a belief is not just to say words in one's mind or to have a mental image or a feeling when one contemplates a proposition, but to be prepared to act on it. But James says, Mr. Peirce, after pointing out that our beliefs are really rules for action, said that to develop a thought's meaning, we need only determine what conduct it is fitted to produce. One cannot find exactly anything like this in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, but in other places, Peirce does say things like this. For example, in a survey of pragmatism, not published in Peirce's lifetime, by the way, Peirce writes, the most perfect account of a concept that words can convey will consist in a description of the habit which that concept is calculated to produce. But how otherwise can a habit be described than by a description of the kind of action to which it gives rise, with a specification of the conditions and the motive? It's fair to say that here Peirce does identify meaning with a rule, a habit of conduct, and James may well have heard Peirce talk in this way. But how does Peirce understand the motive of the habit? In Pragmatism and Pragmaticism, that's the document in which he cuts himself loose from the label pragmatism, Peirce writes, if the meaning of a symbol consists in how it might cause us to act, it is plain that it is how it causes us to act, cannot refer to the description of mechanical motions that it might cause, but must be intended to be a description of the action as having this or that aim. If our quotation from Peirce stopped here, one might accept James' paraphrase. But Peirce goes on, in order to understand pragmatism, therefore, it is well enough to subject to intelligent criticism. It's incumbent upon us to understand what an ultimate aim capable of being pursued in an indefinitely prolonged course of action can be. And Peirce goes on to make clear that the ultimate aim he is speaking of is a development of a set of beliefs, a kind of finished knowledge that we're to approach in the limit but never actually achieve, which will have an aesthetic quality, which will be a free development of the agent's own aesthetic quality, and will at the same time match the aesthetic quality of the ultimate action of experience upon him. In other words, it's the aims of pure science, which are sui generis in referring to the indefinitely long run, that Peirce has in mind here, as elsewhere, and not what we ordinarily call the aims of a piece of conduct, nor for that matter what we all ordinarily call the aims of science either. For James and Dewey, however, this limitation of the pragmatic method to science, or to idealize pure science, it was absolutely unacceptable. And this disagreement is, I think, the real cause of Peirce's decision to disassociate from the movement James called pragmatism and to change the name of his own philosophy to pragmaticism. I turn now to James and Peirce on truth. Peirce, whom James credits with having invented pragmatism, famously defined truth as the opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed on by all who investigate. According to Peirce, this definition is simply an application of the pragmatic maxim, the pragmatist methods of making our ideas clear, to truth. In spite of the very real difference between James' metaphysical views and Peirce's, Variants of this definition abound in James' writing. Such variants began to appear in James' writing long before the Lowell lectures. In the concluding paragraph of the relatively early 1878, remarks on Spencer's definition of mind as correspondence, we find James combining the characteristically Jamesian idea that human beings help to create truth with the Peircean idea that the true judgments are the ones that we are fated to believe, not at any given instant, but in the long run, on the basis of, quotes, the total upshot of experience. Let us look at this passage closely. Here's how the paragraph opens. I, for my part, cannot escape the consideration, forced upon me at every turn, that the knower is not simply a mirror floating with no foothold anywhere, and passively reflecting an order that he comes upon and finds simply existing. The knower is an actor and coefficient of the truth on one side, whilst on the other he registers the truth which he helps to create. Mental interests, hypotheses, postulates, insofar as they are bases for human action, action which to a great extent transforms the world, help to make the truth which they declare. Here the idea that we help to make truth is spelled out in a way that seems innocuous. Our actions determine what will happen, how the world will be transformed, and hence what will be true of the world. In his later writings, James will find a second and more controversial sense in which we help to make the truth. But James is not primarily thinking of historical truth in this paragraph. For after the sentences just quoted, he immediately raises the question, in which he continued to be interested to the end of his life, whether judgments of the should-be can correspond to reality. Can ethical and normative judgments correspond to reality? Can they be true? And responds with a declaration that this possibility must not be ruled out. We know so little about the ultimate nature of things, or of ourselves, that it would be sheer folly dogmatically to say that an ideal rational order may not be real. The only objective criterion of reality is coerciveness in the long run over thought. The only objective criterion of reality, and he means here the only objective criterion of truth, is coerciveness of an idea in the long run over thought. By its very essence, the reality of a thought is proportionate to the way it grasps us, its intensity, its seriousness, its interest in a word. Taking these qualities not at any given instant, but as shown by the total upshot of experience. If judgments of the should-be are fated to grasp us in this way, they are what correspond. The ancients placed the conception of fate at the bottom of things, deeper than the gods themselves. The fate of thought, utterly barren and indeterminate as such a formula is the only unimpeachable regulative law of mind. Although the expression is unfortunate, James is not here confusing the reality of a thought, that is how it grabs us, with the reality of things external to us, the objective criterion of reality, in the sense of the criterion for something's being real. Rather, he's claiming that the criterion for something's being real is precisely that we are fated in the long run to believe that it is. That the belief that it is real, where the it may be something as large as an ideal moral order, exhibits coerciveness over thought. Nor did Peirce himself fail to appreciate the measure of both agreement and disagreement. Hence the remark which I've already quoted, that in the first place there is the definition of James, whose definition differs from mine only in that he does not restrict the meaning, that is, the ultimate logical interpretant, as I do, to a habit, but allows percepts, that is, complex feelings endowed with compulsiveness, to be such. As we've seen, Peirce is referring to James' formulation of the pragmatic maxim for making our ideas clear in the second lecture in Pragmatism, a formulation all of whose parts come from various of Peirce's own writings. But the reservation he expresses is occasioned by the fact that James allows coerciveness over thought, an idea's intensity, its seriousness, its interest in a word. And Peirce is right. What is this if not a complex feeling endowed with compulsiveness? To have weight in determining the truth of the idea, whereas Peirce would require that this coerciveness over thought comes from the testing of predictions implied by the idea, or implied by a larger hypothesis of which the idea is an integral part. This does not mean, however, that on Peirce's view, interests have no role in determining the truth. For as I pointed out a moment ago, Peirce himself wrote, in order to understand pragmatism, therefore, well enough to subject it to intelligent criticism, it is incumbent upon us to understand what an ultimate aim capable of being pursued in an indefinitely prolonged course, ultimate aim capable of being pursued in an indefinitely prolonged course of action can be. And Peirce goes on to make clear that the ultimate aim he's speaking of is a finished knowledge that we are to approach in the limit but never actually achieve, that will have an aesthetic quality which will be a free development of the agent's own aesthetic quality and will at the same time match the aesthetic quality of the ultimate action of experience upon him. And Peirce supposes that all rational inquirers must share this ultimate aim, but James believes that more human and more immediate aims and sentiments must also play a role in determining what the ultimate consensus will be. But in what sense do Peirce and James think of our interests or our ultimate aim as determining truth? The answer is complex. First, for both James and Peirce, truth is a property of opinions or beliefs, and without thinkers, rational inquirers, there are no beliefs or opinions to be true or false. In that sense, both Peirce and James can agree that being interested in having true beliefs determines whether there would be truth. Moreover, our various interests determine what inquiries we shall pursue, what concepts we will find useful, etc. That is, they determine in that sense what truth there will be. But James is willing to draw radical consequences from this last idea, consequences which Peirce is not willing to draw because of what Peirce calls his scholastic realism. That is his belief that only those concepts survive that correspond to real universals, which he calls thirds. The element in James' thought that Peirce objects to is clearly expressed in the sentiment of rationality. There, James writes, of two conceptions equally fit to satisfy the logical demand, that one which awakens the active impulses or satisfies other aesthetic demands better than the other will be accounted the more rational conception. The one which awakens the active impulses or satisfies other aesthetic demands better will be accounted the more rational conception and will deservedly prevail. There is nothing improbable in the supposition that an analysis of the world may yield a number of formulae, all consistent with the facts. In physical science, different formulae may explain the phenomena equally well. The one fluid and two fluid theories of electricity, for example. Why may it not be so with the world? Why may not there be different points of view for surveying it, within each of which all data harmonize, and which the observer may therefore either choose between or simply accumulate one upon the other? A Beethoven string quartet is truly, as someone said, a scraping of horses' tails upon cats' bowels. Yeah. And may be exhaustively described in such terms, but the application of this description in no way precludes the simultaneously applicability of an entirely different description. Just so, a thoroughgoing interpretation of the world in terms of mechanical sequence is compatible with its being interpreted teleologically, for the mechanism itself may be designed. If then there were several systems excogitated, equally satisfying to our purely logical needs, they would still have to be passed in review and approved or rejected by our aesthetic and practical nature. But the disagreement, and it is very important over this claim of James, should not obscure the fact that James, like Peirce, declares his allegiance to a notion of truth defined in terms of convergence or ultimate consensus. This is the last part of the quote I just read. My own reaction to all of this. Consider Peirce's famous pragmatic maxim, the doctrine that we need only consider what conceivable effects of a practical kind the object may involve, what sensations we would expect from it, and what reactions we must prepare. Our conception of these effects, whether immediate or remote, is then for us the whole of our conception of the object, so far as that conception has positive significance at all. This maxim was tremendously important to the three classical pragmatists. And both Peirce and James attached great importance to their different versions of the idea that truth involves coerciveness in the long run over thought. Call this the pragmatist theory of truth. One respect in which the versions are different, by the way, is that James meant human thought, whereas Peirce eventually formulates or reformulates his theory of truth in such a way that what is true is the opinion on which all inquirers will be fated to converge if inquiry were indefinitely continued, even by extraterrestrial species after the human race ceased to exist. Of course, as already mentioned, there are different accounts of the factors that cause beliefs to become coercive over thought. It may surprise you, given my obvious conviction that the classical pragmatists are worth studying, that I do not believe that either the pragmatist maxim or the pragmatist theory of truth is correct, either in Peirce's version or in James' version. To begin with the latter, one effect of the pragmatist theory of truth is to make the truth or falsity of any assertion about the past depend on what will happen in the future, or in Peirce's case, after he revised his original formulation, on what is fated to happen in the future if inquiry is sufficiently prolonged. Consider any historical proposition whose truth value is unknown and possibly unknowable, because perhaps all the records may have been destroyed. Say the proposition about which historians of the British Isles actually disagree, whether Queen Boadicea was really called Boudica. Boadicea was the queen who led the revolt, which almost tossed Julius Caesar's legions out of England. If James is right, the proposition is true just in case evidence will come to light in the future, which will cause competent inquirers to conclude that that was Queen Boadicea's actual name. If Peirce is right, it is true just in case the world is such that competent inquirers must eventually find such evidence, even if it takes billions of years. I see no reason to believe either of these claims. I think what makes the proposition about the past true is what actually happened in the past, not what will happen or must happen in the future. As for the pragmatic maxim, my attitude is as follows. I don't believe that propositions are rules of conduct. And I also don't believe that a proposition's meaning can be exhausted by talking about the sensations it leads us to expect or what reactions it leads us to prepare. Those ideas or related ones were made popular by logical positivism as well as by pragmatism, although the aim of the positivists was to show that metaphysical propositions are meaningless, and the aim of the pragmatists was to ascertain what they did mean. But decades of discussion of these issues in the last century pretty much demolished these claims, to my satisfaction at least. So if I don't accept either the pragmatic maxim or the pragmatist theory of truth, why do I think the pragmatists are so important today? The fact is that although James was extremely keen on his version of the pragmatist theory of truth, hardly any of his interesting metaphysical ideas actually presuppose it. This is something that Bertrand Russell, who detested the pragmatist theory of truth, but was extremely impressed by James' theory of perception, to which Russell gave the name neutral monism, fully understood. And nothing what I like in Dewey depends on the pragmatist theory of truth. In fact, in logic, the theory of inquiry, there's only one reference to the pragmatist theory of truth in a footnote. And although I've said that I can't accept the pragmatic maxim, I can accept many of the applications that James and Dewey made. What I mean by this is that the idea of asking in philosophical positions, of attempted answers to the great philosophical questions, what difference they have made and can make in practice, what difference they make to our lives, is a necessary first step towards bringing philosophy back in contact with human concerns. A first step to doing what Dewey asked us to do when he wrote that philosophy recovers itself when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men. Thank you. Sure. Yeah, please.
I was just wondering if you could say a little something about where you think Mead fits into this narrative at all.
The trouble is we only have a volume of articles by Mead. He never produced, you know, a major work, and I'm not really a Mead scholar.
One problem with man finding what's true or finding what's truly good. Could you explain how the pragmatists helped in that? Because your argument seemed to suppose, thank you, your argument seemed to point to the need of problems as practical.
Okay. The way much of my, although I've been writing on a lot of different fields in philosophy, my Harvard collection of last year, The Place of Philosophy in an Age of Science, has sections on ethics, sections on Wittgenstein, sections on quantum mechanics, and so on. I have been thinking a lot about the fact-value dichotomy. In fact, that started really, my break with positive on that, started when I was teaching at MIT. I came to MIT as professor of philosophy of science in 1961. And I gave, and Paul Ziff had argued in a seminar of his that I attended at Princeton before I left Princeton for MIT, that the supposedly linguistic arguments, or the view that ethical sentences are just emotive or expressive, that this is good is just another way of saying, or hey, let's go for it, that they were all terrible arguments, that all the purely linguistic evidence was against the claim, that claim. So I gave a seminar at MIT, and to which Richard Boyd, who later became a kind of moral realist, he's sort of the opposite of Habermas. I've criticized Habermas for being realist about norms, but not about values. That is, and Boyd almost goes the other way around. Boyd's a realist about good, but not about ought. It's interesting the way people squirm at moral realism. The positivists did achieve that. They made moral realism suspect, which I think is a bad thing, because I think their arguments were terrible. So I gave a seminar on the question whether the arguments for a fact-value dichotomy were any good, especially the arguments from, which did not, so to speak, presuppose a metaphysics, which immediately implied that they were good. There's arguments which are supposed to be just from logic and linguistics. And I came to the conclusion, no, they aren't any good. I didn't write about that at the time, although obviously I continued thinking about that. And in recent years, I published a book called The Collapse of the Value Dichotomy, a book called Ethics Without Ontology, and a book called with Vivian Walsh called The End of Value-Free Economics. And I think the argument is most in the spirit of the pragmatist, and not an argument that descends on the pragmatic maxim, and not an argument that descends on the pragmatic theory of truth. It's simply the argument that, in fact, if you actually look at this supposed paradigm of objective fact, namely science, that the methods of science depend from beginning to end on value judgments. I don't say that rarely are they explicitly ethical value judgments, although that can happen, especially in the selection of what inquiries are worth it for pursuing at all. But that judgments of coherence, simplicity, what Dirac, the founder of modern quantum mechanics, or modern quantum field theory rather, called the beauty of a theory. I mean, Fred Hoyle once told me that he left pure quantum mechanics for astrophysics because Dirac said, Fred, you don't know when a theory is beautiful. In fact, even when a positivist argues, well, you know, all you need is prediction. Just keep testing, or a pragmatist or a Popperian, just keep testing, and you know, and the right theory will be confirmed by experiment. One problem with that is, of course, that Bronowski, who I knew slightly and was a friend of Popper's, said to me that Bronowski told me, I once told Popper if as many crazy theories cross your desk every week as cross mine, you wouldn't say that we test all testable theories. Like I'm not saying we accept theories in modern science simply on the basis of beauty and simplicity and plausibility. The failure of Aristotelian metaphysics says you need something more than beauty and plausibility and coherence. But for sure, you test a small subset of the theories. And moreover, sometimes a theory that turns out to be right is actually accepted before its alternatives were ruled out. That's especially true in the case of Einstein's general relativity, where there were a whole collection of alternative theories which implied all the predictions of general relativity that we were able to test up till the 1970s. It's only when the experiments became super, super precise that you could really rule out, for example, Whitehead's, Alfred North Whitehead, who in addition to being a great metaphysician, was also a great mathematician, and suggested an alternative to the theory of general relativity, one which should not require a non-Euclidean geometry, by the way, which Whitehead opposed. That was ruled out by experiment in the 70s, but it was never taken seriously. And for that matter, when Planck was asked, I think it was Planck, I may have the name. The editor of Annales der Physik was asked why he published Einstein's first paper by an unknown. And so everything in it is really already in Poincaré. And why don't you just go with Poincaré and never bother with Einstein? And Planck said, well, Einstein's theory is simply more simpatico. Es ist mir eigentlich mehr sympathisch in German. It's just more simpatico. There are, the whole picture of value-free science doesn't correspond to the way a science actually works. And I have one of those volumes, I think it's probably Ethics Without Ontology, either that or Collapse of the Fact Value, maybe the Collapse of the Fact Value dichotomy. I have a little paper called The Philosophers of Science Evasion of Values. He describes that Leitz, like this myth that all science does is test all strongly testable theories, the different ways in which positivistic philosophers of science try to avoid admitting that value judgments are involved in science itself. By the way, whenever I've lectured on this to a collection of physicists, and I once lectured to an audience of 80% Nobel Prize winners, I've never had any disagreement. It's the philosophers of science. You can't be that way, but that's the way it is. And the pragmatists did see from the very beginning that Dewey's logic theory of inquiry, James on scientific inquiry, most of what we had to learn from Quine, also on the way bodies are tested, as scientific theories are tested as corporate bodies and so on, all of that was in James, if you'd read James. I mean, this is always the case with the great philosophers of the past. One reads the great philosophers of the past not simply out of piety. That's why I'm reading the Republic again. You always find, when I was working on Aristotle, which I did for a number of years, I always found that Aristotle kept stealing my best ideas. And so I think we should read the Pragmatists or read Wittgenstein. Like, great philosophers make great mistakes. If you look for a philosopher who made no mistakes, you won't find one. But that's not the way to read philosophy. You read philosophy for insights, and you had to decide which are the insights and which are the outsides.
Well, what is the criterion? What is the criterion then for scientific validity? Is it basically aesthetic?
I think that what we've learned from the history of science, especially in the 20th century, is that on the one hand, the aesthetics guides you in choosing which theories are worth testing. And sometimes it leads you to even which of apparently equivalent theories you accept, the case of the choice of general relativity over Whitehead's theory. Actually, Whitehead's theory was, which had never been taken seriously, was only refuted in the 70s, and it was refuted by showing, not by showing by cosmological observation, but by showing a clever mathematical proof that Whitehead's theory implied the existence of a small additional terrestrial tide. So to look at the water, not keep looking not at the orbit of Mercury or the deviation of light near the sun. So it's a wonderful episode. So I would not say that aesthetics alone ever justifies accepting a theory, but that became controversial in quantum mechanics to this day. And there were a very interesting episode. Why is it controversial? Because the form of quantum field theory, on which more theoreticians are hired per physics department than any other, in fact, by order of magnitude. In fact, there's a real question as to whether too much isn't being, too many eggs are being put into one basket. But string theory is where all the action is. And one of my best friends is a string theorist. He said, I'm not so young anymore. We met 30 years before. He said, and we still don't have an experiment. And there were even papers at one time when string theory was basically falsely believed to have certain virtues it doesn't have. It was believed to be unique, that if it's right, then it only has one possible form. And now has so many forms that the question occurs to my mind of whether string theory isn't really a language into a mathematical language into which you could form or deform virtually any theory. But that's here I speak as a mathematician and not as a philosopher. But there were people who said at one time that maybe we should give up the idea that a good scientific theories have to have an experiment to support it. Maybe enough beauty is enough by itself. So the question you raise is really a question that arises within science itself. My own view is still that in the end, if the aesthetic values that scientists employ were simply arbitrary, then the success of science would have no explanation. But nevertheless, I want to see some experiments. So that certainly you can regard some speculation. In philosophy, I don't know that you can require that. Like I think for me, if you ask, well, why are you a realist about science? Why do you think there are real objects out there? The answer is because any other alternative seems to be crazy. And crazy here is a value term. So I think, as I say, when you read Dewey, you'll just almost never find, as the one footnote, an appeal to the pragmatist theory of truth, or for that matter, the pragmatic maxim. The enormous stretches of James are sure the same. So that I think this may have been a felix culpa. They haven't believed in the pragmatist theory of truth and the pragmatic maxim. They wouldn't have been led to do all this wonderful philosophy. What really made it different was this idea of looking at all the consequences of a philosophy, including its moral consequences, the consequence for the individual life, its consequences for politics, and so on. I hear Dewey in that passage I read to you, one of the passages I read to you, I was really saying, what good does it do you if you have a free will, if you live in a society which makes sure that your choices don't count for anything? That's a very different way of looking at the question of free will, causing it to really examine your relation to your society. That's a question, by the way, which German philosophy systematically avoided for 2 centuries, because under Leibniz's influence it decided that, well, die Gedanken sind frei. And maybe Leibniz has really shown that all we monads are really perfectly free. There's this pre-established harmony guarantees that if we do what the Kaiser says, everything will just be fine. Maybe a couple more. I'm blind. Okay, Catherine, move out.
Is that better? Okay, so as you were talking about habits and a will that was capable of being sustained and all that sort of thing. It struck me there was a deeper connection as well. Does it strike you that that's true? At least part of what the pragmatic maxim and the theory of truth are about is the relationship between meaning and conduct. And it is hard to talk about James and Peirce without recognizing that their view of institutional conduct was so different, and indeed has a lot of the sort of determinism versus free will in it. Do you see a connection on that level as well?
I'm not sure I do. I mean, of course, James, of course, did think we could change the world, and Peirce had an odd view that it's bad to use reason in the field of ethics. Because, look, if we start reasoning about ethics, we might end up approving of incest. A very strange argument. He was a conservative who blocked, the idea of thinking, applying all that magnificent philosophic intellect to what to do practically, other than to recommend that we all be pure scientists. He didn't do, but I don't know whether that's, I don't think that's so much inherent to his doctrine. It's a kind of conservative fear. He was just afraid of where really examining his ethical convictions might lead.
I was thinking about, if you take the end of fixation of belief, where Peirce talks about choosing a method like his bride, and the sort of existential choice to become this person who is bound by a standard of inquiry and therefore a standard of living. And if you think about that in terms of the difference between James and Peirce, in terms of pure science and applied problems, in terms of the science versus scientific truths versus the regular truths, it does seem that some of that does have to do with choices you make to be the kind of person you are, which seems to be this sort of very Kantian notion of free will.
But Peirce, as far as I know, as I say, where he does talk about applying that to morality, seems to advise not going there. But I have to say that I don't see this as having more. It's more a sign of interest, I think, to Peirce's biography than really to the substance of his philosophy. It's a limitation in Peirce that he's unable, psychologically unable to go there. Okay? Thank you. We can continue after. Okay.
So where do you fit a theory like string theory into your framework if it's inherently untestable and a lot of its proponents?
I think nowadays the hope is that it will lead to testable predictions. I think if somebody doesn't find a non-ad hoc way of getting testable predictions out of it, then I think it'll be given up. But we may have wasted a lot of money. It's not so much the money, because the money is a fraction of what, say, building the Large Hadron Collider cost, or a fraction of what the Giant Magellan Telescope will cost. There, theorists don't cost billions and billions of dollars. But so many positions that when almost all your theoreticians are just trying one thing, then, of course, that means fewer people are trying to look from, well, maybe a string theory isn't panning out. Maybe we should be looking more for some other way to go. Part of it is simply that some of the string theorists turned out to be just marvelous mathematicians, and there's no question that string theory has made a permanent contribution to pure mathematics. Thank you.